Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another session of the Doctor's Lab with myself, Dr. Abdul Haqq, and my colleague and brother, Dr. Khalid Green. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Khalid.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hayyak Allah. It's good to see you again, Doctor.
And you, my brother, good to be back, mashallah. And today, Khalid, the subject of discussion, lack of religious leadership, a cause for disunity. Wa alaikum salam, Jordan, Malahat, good to see you here. Deuteronomy 22:28, biblical reference. Good to see you. Wa alaikum salam, Tila. I think what we're doing, Khalid, more and more, I think, is engaging on particular issues where they're seldom addressed. And when they are, they're very polarizing. And I think that while you and me, mashallah, tabarakallah, we are on the same page, what's refreshing is that we sometimes come at it from different angles, which I think is very, very important to look at. And while we go through this topic, I'm going to refer to some historical cases, which I think will show particular trends that we are witnessing now and have to be aware of in that particular instance. So I will start off by saying, like, this lack of religious leadership. What do I mean by that? I'm looking from the perspective of the West in particular. And I'm going to look on a macro level, societally, and a micro level at particular communities, the communities that we herald from, in that instance, Salafi communities as well. And I'm going to throw some contentious things out there, Khalid. Like the first thing I would say, an observation that in some areas, many actually, in the micro level, we see that religious credibility is afforded to those who are not from our communities. They happen to be from the predominant South Asian community or the Arab community. And I question whether that's because of a post-colonial mentality, that because the Muslim religion was initially viewed as an Arab and Asian religion, because it was by me before I even considered embracing Islam, that mentality is prevalent amongst black communities in the West. And not only in the West, because when you see the position of some of the black communities and Muslim populations in the Arab world, and when the societies mix, you see it more in Hajj and Umrah, you'll see that there are hierarchical structures in play. In some of the Arab societies, even some of the Asian societies. And yes, the caste system, racism, that has something to do with it. But then there's also a perception from those who are allowing or facilitating that from black Muslim communities. So before I fly over to you, we'll come bring it back to the West. So let's look at the absence of effective leadership within black communities across the West, especially convert communities. You'll see that the breaking down or the disrespect for leadership when it comes from within your own community is something that's rife. I'll look back to Abu Muslim's community in the 90s, and I'm not going to get into the ins and outs, whatever, and that community being dismantled, from what I understand, you will understand the perspective more profoundly than I do, because of dictates that heralded or came from or emanated from the Middle East, from a sheikh. And then others brought that over and were conveying things which actually dismantled and destroyed that community. Similar started happening in the UK, okay, where you were getting edicts, dictates from scholars, which was a very strange thing, Khalid, I say that honestly. And that was being conveyed in communities that were altogether different and alien to the societies that these scholars were issuing these particular fatwa. And they were being conveyed to change the administrative and management structures of those particular communities. And I will say, to be honest, it didn't happen in the community that I came from. This is a strange reality, and it continues today. And I'll hand over to you by saying this. When you look at the leadership in these micro communities that I'm speaking about, Salafi communities in particular, you will see an absence of representation that is which it depicts the very essence of that community. So you will have a black community and you'll have Asian leadership. You'll have a black community and you'll have Arab leadership, and you'll see deference and reference to Muslim lands that endorse that. And also you'll see as well, we look at the students of knowledge who have emanated from the Islamic universities have come from the Muslim world and the Muslim societies. And you'll see that if they are African American, if they are African Caribbean, that they are not afforded the respect that you'll see their Arab counterparts and South Asian counterparts getting from those communities. And that's even from the Black communities themselves. That's why I reference the post-colonial mindset, where within our own communities, we do not legitimize leadership unless it comes from an altogether different place.
Wow. You came out punching to the right and the left and an elbow strike to the face, Doctor. That was real heavyweight. What I can say, or what can I say? No doubt we're dealing with structural racism. We're dealing with, I think something, in all honesty and being with fairness, is also the newness of Islam in these communities. That Islam, even if they're second generation, third generational Muslims, a lot of those communities are trying to move away from certain groups and activities that they experienced prior to Islam. So, for example, if you look at in America, a lot of our communities that are revert communities in the East Coast and so forth, and maybe even on the West Coast to a lesser extent, you'll find that a lot of the communities, they came up through the Nation of Islam. A lot of the Salafi communities, especially revert Salafi communities, a lot of those elders and stuff, they were soldiers in the Nation of Islam. You know, they were, you know, they came from those movements. Some of them, you know, they're entrenched, you know, they come from Black Panther Party background. They have all this, you know, Black revolutionary experience and a part of that experience and tradition. But then now they've come to Islam and they've come to the Salafi understanding, meaning, you know, trying to go to pristine roots of Islam, where they're told that they should disregard that and sever those ties. So I think there's a strong push from those reverts, those communities themselves, to distance themselves from a lot of those aspects, especially in the past, and a push from outside as well. And it's not without legitimacy, because there was a lot of un-Islamic things and ideas. So there's no doubt we have to. We can't throw up a Black Power fist now and you know, march on the Capitol and you know, saying we're followers of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in the same way. So I think so there are some legitimate reasons. Then, as you mentioned, there's the structural issues, the structural racism, the colonial mentality. And again, it was foreign for us. You know, myself, when I came to Islam, you know, I experimented with the Nation of Islam, but it never sat with me, their racism and the nationalism to that extent, you know, their extremism in that, and race theory and all this, and then some of the falsehood. And it had nothing to do with the deen. So I kept searching, and Malcolm X was a big part of that experience as far as reading his autobiography. So, you know, that is a part of that experience. And I think once you get into the Dawah, you kind of, you know, we thought to really negate a lot of those things. And it kind of picks up where we talked about in our last podcast, when I said I had a brother over in Medina, and he saw that I had a lot of history books of, you know, Black history books and autobiography of Malcolm X and this and that and the other. And he said, "Are you still in that Black stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm still Black," you know? And so, I mean, that's something you know, it's a part of me. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created me. That's a part of my culture. My mother's Black. My father's Black. You know, we have our our heritage and so forth. So I think as you pointed out in your models, that it's a growing, excuse me, it's a part of that maturity phase, that now that we've been in the deen for a while, we've matured, we've grown through experiences, we have more knowledge, hopefully, we look at things differently, we see the things that we didn't have to necessarily discard, we're able to adjudicate that. You know, we're able to look at those things and say, yeah, you know, that's a part of my culture, just as my brother from Pakistan, he has his culture, as my brother from Kashmir, the Indian side and the Pakistani side, as my brother from, you know, this tribe in Somalia and this one in Ethiopia, you know, so that they carry their experiences. So getting back to the point of leadership, I think all of those are factors in making this kind of a dilemma for us in our societies as reverts. And there's also some other things, and I'll quickly just mention this really quickly. Some of the reasons we have that lack of leadership, going right to the core of this of our discussion, is number one, our greater Muslim community suffers from this. Although we have a different, we do have in America ICNA and ISNA, who are not representative of me as a Muslim at all. We don't share the same ideology. There's no cooperation. There's nothing. They don't represent me, but they're big and they're powerful. They have money, and they're predominantly Pakistani, probably Arab and Ikhwan Muslimin influenced. They have their own agenda. So they have wealth and power and influence. So in general, we don't really have, as religious minorities in the West, we don't have that community leadership in general. We can't say, oh, go to so-and-so, go to Imam Siraj, go to this one. No, we don't really have that. It's only those micro communities. And then secondly, our history shows us that Islamically, most of the time, Islamic minorities were focused on migration, the hijrah. The Prophet ﷺ himself did it. And this has been the sunnah of Islam, that it has not really, as far as my knowledge, where it has become a comfortable state of affairs where the Muslims stay as a minority. But now there's many more numbers. There's all kind of other issues and systemic issues in the Muslim countries as far as migration. But that's a big, that's a big part of the whole scenario. We came up and we knew that was our push, back when we were coming up, and our du'at and stuff like this. And hey, make hijrah, make hijrah, make hijrah, go study, make hijrah, go study, make hijrah. Okay, which is still kind of push, and it's still important. But again, that also, trying to find our place here in the West is a complex question, really. And how we can participate and how we can establish that leadership. I'll turn it back.
Yeah, no, mashallah, you brought out some very good points. I think that we can touch on some strands that are there. And what I would say to you in this instance there, and mashallah, Floating Man refers to Imam Siraj. I know you've spoken concerning him. I remember in the early days when we came to the Deen, the cassettes that were coming out from America, from Brooklyn. I actually visited the mosque there, were coming from Siraj Wahaj and the way he was hitting it. We know there are some elements that are there as we've developed, but yes, he says that what he did in the 90s, I think speaking to that cannot be ignored. But coming back to what you were saying, there was that shedding of, I would say, if it was the wrong type of nationalistic sentiments that were behind us as we were embracing the Deen. But unfortunately, as we came in and we were looking for direction, some of us, many of us, fell into Arabization, Pakistanization, or South Asianism, if I can call it that. And that was in the garbs that we were wearing, even in the way that we spoke, our vernacular, especially in the UK. Some were speaking using Urdu terms, I think, believing that was part of the culture of Islam. And whilst it might have been the South Asian culture, it might have been the Arab culture in that particular instance, not all of it was actually encapsulated Islam in itself. And I think there needed to be a finding. We were in a unique situation where we were needed to find how to converge the Islamic identity with our identity as Black Britons, as African Americans in that instance. And sadly, that was frowned upon, again, by our own communities and by wider communities who were trying to give us a narrative that the only way to understand Islam and practice Islam culturally was according to what they were doing. And that was incorrect, because we know the Deen, as so far as the cultural elements that do not contradict Islam, is multifaceted. We only have to look at Malaysia, the Indonesians, the African Muslims to see that diversity that is actually there. But I think in this instance, when the lack of religious leadership, you said, on a wider scale in the Muslim world, yes, I agree with you on that. Just like you said, those organizations are non-representative of you in the state, representative of you in America. Muslim Council of Britain and others are non-representative of ourselves. But then it begs the question, should there not be a jigsaw, a mosaic, where particular communities that are proficient and qualified to lead in particular areas, societally and religiously, do just that. And others that are more proficient in other areas do just that. And we come together, not the Ikhwani way that people say, oh, this is the Ikhwani methodology, but we come together, bringing together those elements where we are proficient in. So, for example, when it comes to combating extremism and countering extremism and the Takfiri narrative, we know the Salafi community is most suitably placed and best qualified to do that. So should it be that other communities, and some do that, I know some Sufi communities who defer to me and colleagues of mine, brothers of mine, when it comes to issues of radicalization and understanding it and combating it. That doesn't mean that we now go to say, okay, you need to get more spiritual, we'll defer to the Sufis. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, isn't there some area of convergence among these communities that do have leadership structures in place or are qualified to lead in particular instances? Should there not be coming together, as in the verse, ta'awunu ala bir wa taqwa wal ta'awunu ala al-ithm wal udwan? Okay, cooperate in righteousness and piety, but do not cooperate in sin and transgression. And I remember asking Sheikh Wasiullah Abbas, Hafidahullah, when he invited me to visit him on one of the few occasions in his home, mashallah. I asked him about this verse because I wanted to know about the field I was in, and the fact I was speaking to various communities, Muslim and non-Muslim, about radicalization, how to fight radicalization, identifying what extremism is and it isn't. And I asked him about this verse, and I said, now, if a society are coming together to fight this evil, this particular evil, does that verse apply in that instance for us? Because some will say no, as some do. That ta'awunu ala bir wa taqwa is only with the Salafis, it's only with the Salafis. And I had an issue with that because it's not only the Salafis that are existing amongst the Muslim Ummah and amongst wider society as well. And he said, no, my understanding was correct. That ta'awunu ala bir wa taqwa was on an issue that everyone could converge and work on, but on as long as it's that particular issue. We're not now saying everything and anything in that particular instance. So what do you say concerning that, Khalid? Because I think the issues that we have of not being able to deal with and recognize and support leadership boils down to this to some extent.
Yeah, I think I definitely understand what you're saying, and what I would say is, and I explored this a little bit, and actually I took some quotes from Sheikh Wasiullah Abbas, especially about the issue of voting. Okay, and anyhow, what we see is there's you know, in fiqh you have things which are maslaha am, you know, that have the general benefit for the community. And there's no way you can get away from those major duties that we need each other, you know, as Muslims, as long as you're in the fold of Islam, that those are necessary. For example, if I get in trouble with the law and I have a chance to go to a Muslim lawyer, I'm not going to say, well, do you go khuruj with Jamaat al-Tabligh? Are you takfiri leaning? No, I'm going to need him as a representative in law in this system. Okay, so there are those things which are necessary to function in the society, you know, and there's a necessary type of cooperation. And depending on the society, you know, that's going to, you know, there's going to be a greater or less need for that type of cooperation. So, you know, there are plenty of issues. Even the Eid prayer, for example. Yes, there are some places where you can separate like that, but it's obviously it's better when the Muslims come together. You know, when you have a huge place and you have that can accommodate all the Muslims in that locality or what have you, in that state or in that province in the UK or whatever, where they can all come together and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together, you know. But then there's issues of who's going to lead the prayer. There's, you know, there's issues there. But the point is there are general things that no doubt you have to have cooperation and for the benefit. For example, if someone is oppressing a Muslim in the society, okay, regardless of whether his aqeedah is this necessarily, I mean, he's a Muslim, you know, and he's dealing with those things that, you know, there's going to be a need for the Muslims to probably unite and speak out against this type of oppression of targeting masajid or or something, or general political things that they need in the society. Okay, the masajid, they have bad roads in front of them. We're, you know, your community and our community, we're going to come together. We're going to write governor so and so, or you know, whatever the case may be. There are general areas of cooperation, and I think there's understandings there. For example, in America, we do have some of that. At least I'm thinking of where I'm at. You know, in Washington, for example, you see one of the big Deobandi imams here, who keeps good ties with all the communities, and they generally, there's no, Seattle is a very different place. Washington State's very different. Nothing like Birmingham and the stories I've heard in the UK, or even Philadelphia in America, or other places. I mean, here, you know, because Islam is newer, and although you have groups and sects and you have those splits and those divisions, but there's still some general leadership that realizes, you know, even though they have their Aqidah, you don't really hear them pushing it. They just teach it in their masjid, but there are greater benefits where they have to come together. They're raising funds for children in Burma or whatever. He'll come to a masjid, which is predominantly, you could say, Salafi, and their Aqidah is that of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah or what have you, and they will let him speak, and vice versa, you know, on those. So there are general ways in which people can, you know, have to have that talent.
This is important. What you've said is important, because unfortunately we see, contrary to what you and I are highlighting here, where you see a silence from communities because they're not the same Aqidah, because they're not on the same tariq in that particular instance. You see this often in the West, this lack of support and lending of support to these causes because they're not from us. And they actually speak up against them and say, it's because they're not Salafi that they're going through this, so we're not going to support them. It's because they're not whatever school of thought that we're not. And this is incorrect. This is an incorrect and false premise in the context that we're seeing today in the society we're living in. But I want to move it to another element now.
Before you do, I just want to say, I would say also there's an element of ijtihad here. So I wouldn't really say, I really wouldn't say that it's incorrect, because I'd say it depends on the degree of it. You know, it depends on, you know what I'm saying? You know, and your experience in London or Birmingham is very different than here in Washington State, which is very different than California. You know, the makeup of Muslims, the amount of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, or whatever, and the various groups and ideologies. So, you know, there's a different, maybe even political reality on the ground. If you go to the East Coast in America, you'll find that there are Muslim politicians, Muslim police officers. They are like where Sheikh Tahir and those guys are in Philly. And, you know, it's nothing to have a huge beard police officer who's you know, on the Sunnah even, you know, and having street, the street of Ahl Sunnah, you know, and stuff like that.
That's,
so
thank
it's a different reality, you know.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
I stand corrected. That's right. It's ijtihadi on that issue.
Yeah.
I will make it a minority are incorrect, a minority with the premise. But what you're saying on the whole is the correct, I think, context that should be given there. And that leads us on to the next thing, Khalid, with regards to religious leadership. What we've seen, and I want to be really careful how I say this, and maybe you'll be able to tease this out and understand it, is that we've seen that, yes, Islam and the Sunnah are easy to follow, comprehend, and adhere to. This is the beauty about the deen. But what we've seen is there have been elements of whatever trend you want to talk about, highlighting that fact and basically using it as a premise to say, therefore, they can become religious leaders, and denigrating bona fide scholars and those who have studied in this instance. Okay, and I'm going to refer to. I said I would talk about some historic aspects, and Brother Liam's mentioned a good question.
It's a very good question. I saw that. Can I say something?
I'll let you answer that once I've read this, inshallah. Let me touch upon this. So what I wanted to read here. Challenging clerical authority. This book's talking about the Juhayman situation. Juhayman's difficulties in school may have shaped his critical attitude towards the Sunni idea that restricts authority in Islamic law to men with specialized education. He asserted there were no such grounds in the Quran, the Sunnah, or the ways of the pious ancestors for the idea that a believer must possess specialized knowledge to figure out legal rules. Rather, any believer could examine the Quran and Hadith to come up with legal rules. Okay, he went on there, and while there's some element of validity to what he's saying, some have taken this further to the extent of denigrating the scholars and basically marginalize the scholars because of this particular understanding, taking it further. And we've seen in the West, we've seen it happen. We've got a number of individuals who have not studied, who are not qualified, who are now being referred to as sheikhs. Okay, and we see that not only within the environment and communities we herald from, we see that right across in the West now. Everyone is a sheikh, and some of them haven't studied. They've just been on the YouTube 1,000 times, and they're saying things that resonate with people. So I want to mention here, okay, we see bona fide scholars with this group in the early aspects of their development and growth and legitimization of them, from Sheikh Ibn Baz, Sheikh Abu Bakr al-Jazair, when Sheikh al-Albani used to visit. This was before they went astray, before they went in their direction they did. But continuing with challenging ulama, challenging the clergy as they've, or clerical authority as they've mentioned here. It mentioned this organization, Juhayman's group, the supervisor at the time, before they went extreme, Sheikh Abu Bakr al-Jazair, receives complaints about the group's unorthodox ways. And in the summer of 1977, he arranged a meeting at the group's house in Medina in an attempt to persuade them to return to the regular ways of worship. Several leading members of the group attended, but Juhayman stayed away. Okay, so Sheikh Abu Bakr al-Jazair wasn't listened to in that instance, and Sheikh Bilal Phillips, mashallah tabaraka, gives a very good account of what took place in Medina on the roof of their headquarters. Sheikh Abu Bakr al-Jazair speaking to them, Juhayman's followers breaking off from him in that particular instance. We see that taking place today, and I don't want to continue to talk about a particular group, but I'm even talking more widely amongst us in that instance. We see that distancing from scholars, okay, and then we see a leadership taking root amongst us locally in our own societies. Okay, and this is worrying, but then also I will flip it and say there are times when edicts or directives coming from Muslim countries into our societies from scholars should be challenged if they are not fitting with the reality upon which they are addressing or supposed to address.
Jamil, I think the key with that is that, for one, it's going to require ilm to be able to discern that, to discern, okay, is this fitting or not to a degree? Because if we leave it to the average Muslim and anybody who, even if they studied a little bit or they didn't study or they studied a lot, and they, are they in that position to really determine those benefits and harms? So that's, I understand what you're saying. And I think we've kind of touched on this. We've had these discussions before that, people misusing fatwa, and, the scholars, mostly, they are not blameworthy in those situations. Because again, as we say, a part of making a fatwa, a hukm ala shay farin ala tasawwurihi, meaning a part of making a ruling on something is that you have a clear understanding of its background. You have a good picture about it. So, for example, if we're talking about an individual, sheikhs, what do you say about the individual? I see this all over the YouTube, and I want to mention this. It's done in Arabic and it's done in English, so it's not even blameworthy to a particular, but you see people across the board. They'll say, Sheikh Salih bin Fawzan spoke about so-and-so. He warned about so-and-so. And if you know Arabic and you listen to the question, you see the sheikh did not. So the people gave some general characteristics. They got a ruling from the sheikh, said, oh, whoever says that is like this. Then they apply it. See, Sheikh so-and-so warned against him. And this is exactly what we have had in the West, and it's deplorable, So this is a lot of academic dishonesty that we see from a lot of people. So going back to your point, is, as you said, is that even that takes fiqh. It isn't just everyone can just, this doesn't apply to us. We like to drink wine. If we left it up to the general people, you'd say, hey, it's hard to get married. I have to have 3 girlfriends. I have to try. 1, 2, 3. I got to try them all. I can't, it's my society, my culture. No, we can't. You can't leave it to the whims of the people. It has to be based on knowledge, even to determine that, though, looking at those harms and those benefits. And going to the brother's question, I believe, who said about that being, looking at the general benefit, is that an issue of ijtihad? It's ijtihadi in determining the tatbiq on how to practice it. For example, I could say, hey, really, it's general benefit for the Muslims not to speak about each other at all. I could say that, okay? That goes against so much of the usul of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah. But I could say, hey, there's general benefit. We never speak about religious innovation. If this one wants to say supplicate to the dead, it's okay. It's his right, and we don't want to cause disunity. It's for the general thing. So my point is, and we know that's false. The point is that when we're talking about this general benefit, that requires some ijtihad in determining what is the general benefit. That's why we need strong religious scholarship and leadership in the West as well. We need that. We need, not just, we have, mashallah, a lot of good students of knowledge, and they have levels, and some of them are stronger than others, and some of them, mashallah, are mashayikh, and some of them are, a few of them are even more than that. They have strong levels. We have some mashayikh here in America, and in the UK, and but some that are very strong.
Yeah, you're right.
So before you come in, so my thing is, I lost my point. Go ahead.
No, just I'm sorry about that.
I was going on a little bit. Go ahead.
A lot of comments, very good comments coming in. That's very good, Khalid, and I agree with you. So what is the issue? Why is there not an acceptance of religious leadership? We have many significant individuals who have studied and have returned amongst our societies. And I'm going to put it out there. And they are African American and African Caribbean or mixed heritage in that instance. And yet we see the first people to bring them down are from amongst those very communities themselves. And I think that, I don't know, is it a slave mentality syndrome where we can't recognize our own? Because if you take it outside of the Muslim community, you'll see that still happens in wider society amongst black people in itself. But when it is someone from outside of these communities, as I've said from the beginning, then they're accepted. If it's, you see a particular cult, it's headed by South Asian. You see others who are prominent. They may be white converts in that particular instance. And those communities that have those graduates, that have those leaders, do not put those individuals forward. But you'll see them bringing elements of dissonance and discord from outside those communities, from scholars that they've got them from, or individuals who've gone to those scholars, and those individuals are from outside of the community, coming back and saying no, and basically dismantling communities in order that they can enter. We saw that in one of the communities in America. We saw a British mixed cultural individual who studied in Yemen for a while, come from the UK and lead an American community, destructively so, and brought whatever fitna and problems from where he was from in the UK into that community. So the question asks, well, why is that happening? What allows that to happen where we can't recognize leadership from among our ranks? Alhamdulillah, Brixton, the community I came from, that was there by and large. Alhamdulillah, was community leader for 15 years. We had a leader before that. Okay, not so much leadership there now, it's just management, but that was there for a while. There were issues. There were issues. Trust me, there were issues that caused a parting of waves, if you want, by many of us who came to the deen together, unfortunately. But that's an altogether different situation. But still, the community didn't then become led by someone who wasn't from amongst that community, who ethnically or socially or demographically in that instance. Whereas you see around other communities, in your country particularly, that you'll see it's not being led effectively by those from amongst your community. So that causes disunity, but that I would question in some instances, that's deliberate. Poverty of the mind, excellent statement. Poverty of the mind, and I think that not looking beyond that Arabized, Asianized construct that Islam is a religion of the Far East, when in actuality, we know that it first spread to Africa.
Barakallah fiqh. Yeah, I think there's very much, as you mentioned, unfortunately, there is that that slave mentality. We can't get away from that. We can't escape it. In that, a lot of us, we don't have that confidence in ourselves, even if we claim otherwise. And you see that. You'll see that, as you mentioned, there will be individuals who are less qualified, but they're from another, just because they're from another background, they're put forward. And even amongst people who may be from the, this is a problem. It's a big problem of a mentality, no doubt. It is a slave mentality. I would also say that this is not something which is endemic to all the groups. So, for example, if you look at groups that are, unfortunately, they're not our role model in that sense, especially Creed and so forth, but they do not accept this at all. That would have been, for example, the Worth Dean community and those offshoots. They don't play. They have black talent. They have people who are professionals, well-educated. They don't have the Islamic knowledge mostly, but they are well-educated, and no one else is going to tell them anything of what to do. They run their own show. And unfortunately, a lot of other groups that were non-Muslim groups but claimed Islam, we've had a lot of movements like that were very, even in the 60s and 70s, that wore niqab. The sisters wore niqab. For example, Dr. Abdul Bilal Phillips, he exposed the cult of the Ansar cult in America. Yeah. And Dr. York's group. And if you look at their pictures, they were learning Arabic in the 70s or 60s, whatever. And the sisters were wearing niqab back then, and pretty amazing stuff. But he was just a shyster doing some evil stuff. And the point is, but one of the things he said, I don't care anything about us Sunni Muslims, whatever. He said, we own our building. And that's pretty powerful. And if you look at even the Nation of Islam, they have religious structure. So I don't say that we need to adopt their ways necessarily, but I'd say in the areas that are permissible, we do need structure. We do need to have that professionalism and leadership in our communities. Otherwise, it remains folda. For example, we have new Muslims. We lose them all the time. Whereas if you look at the Nation, they have a program and they discipline people when they think. I'm not saying we should do that. And even as someone mentioned, Imam Siraj, that's how they used to kind of operate, because they were closer to that era and closer to those movements that, they used to. We have a lot of communities that used to do stuff to people when they were very sinful or wife beaters. Look at Abu Muslim's community, as you mentioned, and that was closer to Salafi Dawah, closer. I don't say, but I say closer. But the way they used to do it, I know countless stories of people who were right there, and I used to visit as well, or I visited, and, a wife beater might get confronted right there. He's called to the office, Big Abdullah, big man, his fist about this big. Oh, you beating your wife? Bow! They were trying to implement the Hudud, but they weren't as bad as some of the other communities that really. So there's a negative side. There's a balance, in establishing this leadership that, of course, it's within the bounds of the Shara, but I think these are all kind of ijtihadi areas of how do we operate as a Muslim minority, and how do we establish that leadership, and how do we, these are somewhat new issues that we're confronted with. So.
And I agree. And I think that what you said there, you said something earlier, and this just reminded me of that. We are living in a time where Muslim minorities in the West are that huge. Okay, there's that discussion around the fiqh of minorities and everything like that. And as you said before, it was about the hijrah, and to an extent that's still spoken about. But when we're being real, the question is, you don't get nationality or can actually reside fully in some of these particular societies. But there was that element there about the size of the minorities in the West now is requiring a fiqh I'm not saying new, some of it is new, obviously, because of some of the things that are being faced, and the scholars are looking and addressing that. But as you've rightly said, we have people of knowledge who have grown in our ranks, studied abroad, have come back, and are bringing that context into the societies that we come from now, which is very, very important. But I think, Khalid, when we are talking about the mindset, you've mentioned Nation of Islam, you've mentioned Ansar Allah. We've had individuals, mountains among us, like Dr. Bilal Phillips. He wasn't given the respect. He hasn't been given the respect, even now. And he's got the largest online university that's there, period, okay, amongst the Muslims. And we didn't give him, I'm saying collectively, not you and I, we didn't give him the respect that was due, but we were quick to rush to and identify Arab and South Asian scholasticism and scholarship and point to them. If we were to speak now, you and I, we'd start naming African scholars. And I'm sorry, some might be thinking, why is Abdul Haqq talking about black leadership in this particular instance? Because when we're talking about leadership of communities, it's very easy to identify leadership of other ethnicities in the West, as well as in other countries, societies. But when you look in the West and you try to identify leaders of black communities, because the black community is one of the fastest that embraces Islam, that's growing in Islam. Also, it's the black community, black Muslims, that are finding a huge black backlash, I was going to say backlash from the wider non-Muslim black communities for being Arabized, okay, for basically minimizing our blackness, our African roots, or such like. So we've got that double whammy where when you look inward to the Muslim community, for example, you're seeing that there's that pointing towards other ethnicities for religious leadership, as though we don't have legitimacy by virtue of our newness, by virtue of us being converts. And then when we look at the wider black community, they're looking at us and saying, you don't engage with wider issues that are pertinent to you as well. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, you are following an Arabized understanding of the religion, whereas we see African Muslims in Africa practicing the religion and the Sunnah without any Arabization. So what's happened to you black Muslims in the West and this absence of leadership? When we look at our communities, the Salafi communities, all we see is infighting. We see a lack of transparency when it comes to financial leadership as well. There are some big issues jumping off in the UK at the moment with all communities, even mine, with regards to dishonesty, lack of transparency when it comes to individuals who are in position of responsibility. So this is a very serious issue. But I want to do one thing, Khalid, as well, as we're moving on. I think we're flowing quite nicely in this instance. I'll let you jump back in. But I want to talk from a perspective. We have spoken about sex, and I'm bringing this from a religious leadership perspective as well, because I think the context I'm going to highlight really needs to be addressed, because when we speak about sex and cults, immediately we bring the Islamic paradigm, which is understandable. And you get those subscribing to that paradigm, the saved sect, the Taif al-Mansura, Aswad al-Adham, and all of these. And we know them. And especially those of us who are Salafi repeat them as a mantra, almost as justification for the things that we're doing. And before I go into this thing, I think someone, Zeki, said something about the inferiority complex amongst black individuals. And he's got a very, very good point about that. But here now, I want to look at what a cult or sex look like from a Western perspective, because as it's described, it fits a number of communities. And we're not talking about the religious context, we're talking about a Western academic context. And this is necessary because many see these sects, from the Western understanding, as leadership entities, when in actuality, they're not. Yes, Zaki to Dunya. I think a lot of black reverts suffer from an inferiority complex. Lack of support from the Ummah doesn't help either. And he's very right in that instance. But I would say there to Zaki to Dunya with that very pertinent point, it's time for the converts and the black reverts to stop looking at others to identify or self-identify themselves. It's time to stop doing that, because that's why we're in the situations we're in. That's why we don't have a strong platform of leadership. That's why you'll see those saying, no, all we've got to do is learn Tawheed and the Sunnah, and we don't have to do anything else other than that. But if we truly learn Tawheed and the Sunnah, we will move and change societies in the same way we saw the Maccan society dismantle because of Tawheed and its implementation and its actualization, as we saw with the Sunnah and its implementation and its actualization. It cannot just be stuck with the books and teaching, and we don't see any actualization or implementation of that knowledge, and then it's not knowledge, it's information that we're holding back. And then we chastise those who are academically qualified, those who are in the professional realm, because they don't have the same dedication or time to sit and learn as those of us who have sat and learned that particular level of knowledge at a very rudimentary level at that. So now I'll bring that context of the Western aspect of the sex, because it's very applicable to these entities that are considered as religious leaders. So here, Rodney Stark and William Sims Bainbridge, what they said about Juhayman's group, and listen to this and place it into context today, and we may be able to identify various entities that fit this, okay? He says here, a sect is a religious group that rejects the social environment in which it exists. They write that sects live in a greater or lesser degrees of tension with society. The ideal sect falls at one pole where the surrounding tension is so great that members are hunted as fugitives. These authors go on to suggest that because sects are schismatic groups, they present themselves to the world as something old. They left the parent body not to form a new faith, but to re-establish the old one, from which the parent body had drifted. Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah had drifted. Sects claim to be authentic, purged, refurbished version of the faith from which they split. Because sects consider society to have strayed from the true religion, they withdraw from society and form a distinct subculture based on rigid rules for its members' behavior. Okay, and Juhayman's group stood out for that. They stood out for their extraordinary efforts to shape personal behavior according to detailed rules in the Sunnah. Now, when we look at Nation of Islam, it wasn't in the Sunnah, but we saw that very strict regime that was there. We see amongst some Salafi cults. We see amongst some of the individuals amongst us. We see generally amongst us the Salafis who are not cult followers or cult members, that strict adherence to outward acts of devotion, principles, worship. And then what happens there in that instance, Khalid, others see that and they believe these people are upon the haqq, which they are by and large, which we are by and large. And the behavior that we are showing in a society that is liberal, that is progressive, that is plural in that particular instance, is more attractive to them. But once they come within the fold of this and understand this leadership structure, it's either you adhere 100% to what they are saying, and you subscribe 100% to what that group or leadership structure is saying, or you are chastised, you are marginalized, and in many instances, it leads to mental and social stigmatization and breakdown because you are not 100% part of that mindset and group think. That type of religious leadership is a sect, is cultism, isn't the Taif al-Manshura, isn't Aswad al-Adam, isn't that way in a Western context as we're witnessing it today. And the fruits of what I'm saying are evident in the destruction, the absence of leadership, and the polarization that's taking place amongst those very communities themselves.
No. That I could say on that, Doctor. Really, yeah, we have a lot of issues, and I think it's basically having the knowledge to be able to discern those traits, those dangerous traits of sectarianism. But I think, I don't know, they were talking about the Juhayman incident, and we see a lot of people, they have their these traits, this cultism, this hizbiyah, these traits. And I think that the danger lies, because I can think of a lot of concrete groups that are Muslim groups that that fell into this, and more that I'm in touch with would be from our culture, meaning that they have African American background that I know. For example, we had the trend, like you said, we mentioned the Ansar,
Something's happening there. Yeah, something's happened there with the recording. Hopefully, Khalid will jump back on with us very, very quickly. I'm not sure what happened there. It's important that those who are viewing this really try and comprehend, and I'm sure that you are, what Khalid and I are speaking about with that points to the absence of this religious leadership. And the title is religious leadership, not academic, not professional, because it's the religious leadership that would really structure what we are doing and how we exist in the society that we're living in today. And the historic perspective that I've been referring to with regards to Juhayman is that I haven't referenced the book, but it's the Mecca uprising, an insider's account of Salafism and insurrection in Saudi Arabia, an account of Nasser al-Husaymi, who was once with the Juhayman group. I would advise those of you who want to know about that reality that led to the storming and siege of Makkah in 1979, listen to Dr. Bilal Phillips' account of that. There's a 1993 recording where he gives eyewitness accounts to that instance. But it was necessary, and it is necessary, to look at that and to look at what happens with those who end up leading these particular groups. So, for example, when we see the characteristics of those who lead some of these sects and these cults, who we hold to be religious authorities, here's one of the descriptions that is given in the book as well. Apparently, Juhayman possessed the instincts of a charismatic leader, able to mesmerize men with advanced degrees and draw them into a poorly planned venture, such as the ill-fated attack on the Grand Mosque. Okay, in the aftermath of the Mecca uprising, these same men wondered what had happened to their ability to reason. At times, he manipulated members, by pretending to ignore them, as occurred to Husaymi when he began to distance himself from Juhayman's faction. So, in the aftermath, you had educated individuals who questioned how they had fallen for this type of religious leadership. Yes, the charisma of the leader, as we see that with many sects, not only within Islam, but outside of the fold of Islam. But we see that they will basically forget about rationale reasoning and looking at things at face value. Yes, Dr. Khalid is having a technical issue. We hope he comes back very soon. But we see that today, the charisma of such individuals. We see that denigration and marginalization of knowledge. We see that those who embrace religion and Islam in this particular instance, and the Salafi methodology more specifically, that some of those, not all, who have embraced it because of its simplicity, then believe that the level that they have entered and that they are at, and reading a few translated works and changing their outward appearance, as many of us did, suffices to such an extent that we can lead those more qualified than us religiously, who have studied professionally, academically, who the latter having life experiences that are more extensive than these who are at very rudimentary levels of religious knowledge, rudimentary levels of academic levels. And as you heard Dr. Khalid refer to my cognitive development framework, that there's a progression, and you'll find that those who are leading are at not the first stage necessarily, which is the founding cognitive phase, but they may be at the second youthful phase, which is idealistic, a lot of zeal, overzealousness, and they're speaking and they're at the front, and people are liking what they're saying because of the energy that they had. We were all at that particular stage, but are they at a stage where they should be religious leaders? When you've got the second, the third and fourth stage, which is basically the adult phase, the mature phase that Khalid referred to, which shows that you've now actualized the knowledge, which shows you've comprehended your learning, which shows you've been able to marry up what you know religiously and know your deficiencies therein with what you know professionally, academically, and with your life experiences. And I've ad-libbed and carried on. And Khalid was speaking at that point, and I'm going to let him come back in. I don't know if he was hearing what I was saying at that point.
I missed a lot. I missed a lot of it, but you can hear me okay now?
Definitely, yes.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Yeah, that you know, the issue of the sectarianism and the cult-like behavior is a very dangerous thing that we have to be wary of when we're trying to establish leadership. And on the other end of the spectrum, like I said, there's a lot of internal groups that I have experienced firsthand, and they made that cultural break with a lot of the you know, with overseas and, you know, and Arabization and so forth, and emphasize their understanding of Islam and their cultural aspects. The problem is you find a lot of problems if it's not guided without knowledge. And when you have such a conscious break that you're really trying to break with that and say, hey, we know enough of our Islam, we're going to do it. I mean, I know people now who still have that mentality. Let's do it. Enough books and enough this. We understand that zeal. I understand it and so forth. But again, it has to be guided with proper Islamic education. And some of the problems with that, I can give you real examples of people that I used to function with. I did not have the bay'ah, but a lot of the groups in America, we have a long history with the secret bay'ah, the secret Pledge of Allegiance. You know, so basically a lot of these imams, even Imam Siraj has a lot of experience. I don't know if he had bay'ah or if he does have bay'ah. I'm not sure. But the bottom line is,
I don't think he did.
Yeah, well, he's very aware of it. And, you know, there's a lot of controversy there. Anyway, a lot of the groups, a lot of those old groups especially, and they tried to establish their communities very strong on Islam from their understanding. But then you had a lot of fatwa, a lot of things coming from them without knowledge. And you had that zeal. And some of the repercussions, I'll give you a real example. I was told once by one leader, and he said, go to the airport and pick up this guy. Don't ask him any questions. Okay, we were young and we were part of the Jama'at, but I was one of the few who didn't have the bay'ah. Okay, but I functioned tight with him, but I just didn't feel comfortable with that. Getting a bay'ah, making a pledge of allegiance to somebody. So I go, I pick up the guy, we bring him in. He marries a sister from the community, new Muslim sister, and just kind of disappears. You know, he's underground. I find out later that this guy was wanted by the FBI and other states for trying to implement, well, he implemented what he thought was the hudud on his wife. And this sacred community was hiding that, you know, hiding this individual. So you have a lot of things like this because these communities, they had the zeal, they wanted the leadership, they have excellent speakers. Some of them come from big movements outside of Islam and they're charismatic and stuff. But there's a great danger because of the lack of real religious knowledge. And that is why it's so important, I believe, to not sever those ties, keep those ties with the scholars. The bottom line is, when I talk about scholarship, I'm talking about mainly scholars that I know in the Arab Peninsula. The bottom line is, I'm talking about scholars from Saudi Arabia, scholars from Yemen, scholars from Jordan. Those are the ones who I feel comfortable taking my knowledge from. And I've looked at other scholars and those who came from that same madrasa, that same school. And so what you have is you have a lot of half-baked people in a lot of the Western countries that want that leadership, and they do have a good zeal. Again, it's going back to, even though they are at the mature stage, they've been Muslim for 30 years, 40 years, but because of their active severing those ties, that zeal is a very dangerous thing. In America, we have a lot of groups that actually used to try to implement the hudud. Like I gave you the example of Abu Muslim's community, which was closer to Salafi, you know, but you have a lot of other groups that are further away and they used to do some stuff. Those guys used to have shootouts. Those guys have disappeared people. You know, we've known enough brothers who, alhamdulillah, are now in goodness, but before, when they were a part of other groups, they have what we say bodies. They've got bodies. That means they have made people disappear off the face of the earth, you know? And that is, it's a problematic when you try to implement that zeal without the Islamic knowledge and without the tarbiyah, without the raising up of the community based on Islamic knowledge and principles and morality. So I know you're not saying any of that, but it's just it's a tension when we try to when we're trying to establish that religious leadership, we do need that guidance.
No, what you're saying, speaking to that, I agree entirely, because I will give you, when at the helm of the Brixton community, had we not had those ties with the scholars, and some of them from the West, like Dr. Jibali, for example, we saw as a leader for amongst us. And I would say, I'm not going to go into detail, we were on the line and was on another line, and we were just waiting for him to say, and I'm not going to say him, and some other scholars that we were speaking to, literally waiting to disappear, someone, as you call it.
Yeah.
And that happened on a few occasions, and we were giving all the explanation and the rationale, and we're saying, Sheikh, they're outside the house now, they're ready to do the move, he's done this against the Sharia. It was non-Muslims, obviously. Yeah. And the Sheikh was saying, you, Abdul Haqq, brothers, you cannot do this. You cannot do. So we were continually going back to them. So that connection with the scholars, I agree entirely with. What I don't agree with is when we're asking scholars to give advice or edicts to change administrations among us. And that has happened. It's happened in America. They've tried it in the UK. And that is wrong, because those scholars do not have that jurisdiction in that particular instance. Okay, they don't have that jurisdiction to.
Well, it's going to be on those communities anyway that they're going to make those decisions. So I guess if there are communities that are really tied to the scholars in that sense, and they're trying to make an educated, realm and use that as a hujjah. Well, Sheikh so and so said, it's going to be on those communities what they decide. Those are side issues that happen. But I don't think that's the. Yeah,
while they decide that is incorrect, in the same way that you wouldn't have anyone from a Western community coming into an Arab community saying to them, you need to implement this educational realm and choose this person in this from your community who's less religious and such, or more religious. It wouldn't happen that way from an academic aspect. I know that's totally different from religion, but the point is that that's where the problem is exacerbated, and that's something that shouldn't happen. I think religious leadership.
I just want to say, this. I'm with you, but also at another point, I just want to mention, because we have this trust with the scholars. So you're asking for that scholarly advice. We do it all the time. So I don't see there being necessarily a problem. It's just if it's misused and abused. For example, if you have somebody in your community and he is a wicked fasik, this guy does zina, he's stealing the money and so forth, and you guys realize it's attention, but then you want some more strength, so you call up one of the scholars in Saudi Arabia or whatever, in Egypt, whatever, because that has a more powerful effect on the community, and that individual might leave or convince other people in the community or whatever, then no problem, because you are following what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordered you to do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so if you don't know, ask the people of knowledge. So I don't see that. I see when it's abused. Yes, I'm with you. But on the other hand, we don't want to negate the fact that if that community feels it is necessary, for example, a lot of the controversy with one of those communities in Philly or New Jersey, when Sheikh Tahir was teaching them and giving them so much benefit, then they had to get a fatwa from one of the mashayikh, and he warned, he said, no, Tahir is this, according to the information they gave him. So then he wasn't allowed to speak at that masjid or whatever, these kind of things. There's going to be abuse, unfortunately. There is abuse by people, but that doesn't negate the point of asking the scholars if you feel if it's something necessary, if there's a benefit. That's all I'm saying. I'm just bringing that there. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
No, but a distinction in what you've said. One of them where you're saying asking advice of the scholars, that's one thing, and I agree. That's what you're speaking to. I agree with you entirely. But where the scholar now is told you can make decisions on changing this one and that one and that one, and then the scholars say, yes, put this one in, change that one. That's nothing to do with respect to the scholars. That's nothing to do with the scholars in that particular community setting. And that's where there is an abuse. But when it's advice now, okay, we've got this issue, what you say, and the scholars' words carry weight, as you've said, and you can convey that to the people, yes, but not the decision making, the executive decision making of the structure of that Western Muslim community. No, that is not something that should be encouraged. We've seen it's been misapplied and abused more than there's been any benefit from that. But I think, Khalid, as we're drawing to a conclusion, we've gone slightly over because we wanted you back.
Okay.
We wanted the juice from your input, mashallah. I think that, mashallah, this isn't a conversation just like the previous ones that can continue, that can roll. But I think that it's very, very important that we start acknowledging those who are qualified among us, okay? Those who are trusted among us, without the factionalism, without the partisanship that's taking place, without the hizbiyah, if you want to give a more religiously terminized word, to recognize those individuals, what they've put in of the studying, their connections with the scholars, and if they're capable, their abilities to lead the community with support from within the community. Not necessarily having all religious people around them, but we know a good team, a good leadership management team will have someone who's financially astute, someone who's academically astute, someone who's politically astute with the local arena and an environment that they're in. And I think that needs to be inculcated among us, because I believe that there are many who are at a very rudimentary level who are content with the state of affairs, the status quo, where every Tom, Dick and Harry is giving his perspective, is causing dissension, wants to be listened to, and you don't see progress, you see regression. And if we're on a deen that is progressive in the religious sense, not the progressive movement that we've been talking against the past few weeks, is progressive, and we know that it has everything, all of the ingredients, then it's time for us to really start looking at those individuals who can lead us, who have the courage. It was mentioned by one of the viewers about having the courage, the bravery, like Muhammad Ali, like Malcolm X. And those who have it will have haters. They will have haters. But we've got to stop looking at what the people say, and we've got to look at what needs to be done. And when we stop looking at what the people say and what needs to be done, and those who can do what needs to be done, we need to get behind them, we need to support them, and we need to take things forward. And if we're not concerned about our own generation now, which I don't think many of us are, to be honest, we need to look at our children, because what we are providing and leaving for our children is pitiful. Is pitiful. And I'll stop there.
No, I'm with you 100%. And one thing I would just add or emphasize is the importance of the team. You mentioned a team in that, for example, I used to have these conversations with Shadid Muhammad when he was graduating, and talking about how some of the young graduates, okay, mashallah, they've got the knowledge because these guys have studied, and they go back to those communities which have brothers who have a lot of experience, but they clashed instead of coming together to benefit from that experience as well as that knowledge. You need that. You need that panel.
Right. You
need to, and I think this is where some of the newer du'at, or ones who are kind of newer on the scene anyway, compared to, 10, 20 years ago, that they are kind of realizing that. And that's why you're seeing some of them come back, and they're working together with a variety of different people who have talents, because there is indispensable knowledge and experience from those elders that you can benefit. And I'll give an example. There's he's a famous American imam. He's from the time of Bilal Phillips era. I think he came in after, or he might have graduated before. He's like, right around there, the sheikh. And I haven't heard from him in years. But anyhow, he was a famous imam in California and New Jersey. Anyhow, we had some interesting conversations in Medina because he was back and we were teaching together. And he's an old graduate from Jama Islamiyah. But his whole way of thinking, so I would be kind of like, Salafi Dawah, this, and he said, brothers, Salafis, when that stuff came with so-and-so, and he mentioned some very famous du'at that we know, when those guys came back, and some of them didn't even study, he said, they just broke apart all the good we were doing. I said, okay, yeah, they had their problems, but I say that isn't reflective of the Dawah, because he had his leanings. But one of the things that stuck with me
is because he had that experience. And I used to ask him questions about leadership and so forth. And he said, Khalid, he said, our people are different. He said, when you approach them, he said, yeah, we're not into implementing the hudud, but they've got to fear some repercussions. These are the kind of communities. So he gave me all these war stories from being, with Siraj and way before, and all those communities and traveling in Philly and, washing bodies that have been stabbed, however many times. And, but the way they had to deal with those things was very hands-on. And I mean, physically hands-on. So my point is we have to make that convergence of the Islamic knowledge based on the book and the Sunnah, as well as those people who are favored and have that concrete experience and those management. And as you mentioned, maybe we've got a brother who's in accounting, a brother who's a web developer, all those professional talents. We need to put that together in those communities and build. But I think this all sounds good, but I think there's still an endemic problem that we have to overcome. And that is just some of the self-hatred and some of those other things, because it sounds good. I mean, I had all these good ideas that I wanted to, and I've been talking to brothers for years before I came back. Now I came back, it's almost like it's abandoned. And I just feel saddened with a lot of brothers that I know. And they say, when you come back, you're going to do this, and we want you to be the imam. We want to do this. We want to do this. Everything is just, those guys don't even listen to me speak. And it's not that I want them to listen to me speak, but my point is I just say it's kalam fadi a lot of times. It's wasted speech. No one is that serious about establishing Islam and benefiting their children. No one's that serious. They say this and it sounds good. I mean, some of the brothers, we had a meeting after the George Floyd and stuff and because the disbelievers made that issue important. So everyone, African-American Muslims, we got to do this. Ahi, man, brothers, I was getting frantic calls like it was serious. I said, okay, when I get back to Seattle, we'll talk about it and we'll see, let's organize. We had one meeting and it was so apparent how different our ideas were. And then after that, there was nothing to follow up. It was just like totally. So, you don't want to give up. But for me personally, I see that you have to go search out like-minded people. And me personally, I feel I would probably be better off in a community that needs that. But if I was in the ghettos in Detroit, as rough as it is, or Chicago, some of those places where they need that and where they will respect you as your thing, because here, aside from the racism, aside from this and this and this and this, we just got drama and issues. And the few people who are reverts and so forth, or African-American or reverts in general, nobody's doing nothing. They don't care about, it's their livelihood. It's a nice thing over tea and coffee to talk about these issues, and then it's gone. So, it's really saddening, but it just makes me put my energy elsewhere. For me, it's about Markaz Al-Athari Institute, getting this up, teaching people, and helping to benefit in any which way I can, and going forward with the doctor's lab, doctor. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. And I want to conclude to show that we shouldn't be disheartened when, and I'm not saying it was the best era, but when I was nominated as chairman of the Brixton Mosque community in 1994, and that was from the wider non-Salafi community, because the short tenure of the brothers who I was with but didn't agree with their methodology was short-lived. It was only about 8-9 months, and then I was outside arbitrators camp came in. It's a long story, but that heralded it in. What we saw in the 90s, and you've heard about it yourself, in the early noughties, the brothers that were together, the leaps and bounds that we made, the conferences that we starting the school, Iqra Independent School, our wives and our sisters started Iqra Independent School, which is continuing to this day, Ofsted Outstanding School, those who are running it now. So we saw unity. I saw brothers, sisters get behind me as a leader. And I remember sitting with when I went on Umrah, I said to the scholars, I'm not somebody of knowledge. They said that's not an issue. Through the annals of history, you had leaders, but as long as you are attached to the people of knowledge and you've got those who are referencing the people of knowledge, then carry on in your position. And we had that model. And we were very close to Sheikh Al-Albani. and his students. And I'd ask him things when it came to purchasing the mosque, when it came to purchasing a dawah organization that I was establishing. We would go back and ask for guidance in those particular areas. So we were very much attached to them. We were very close, as I said, to the Jordanians more than any of the shuyukh that we knew. And Abu Sama came in amongst us, was teaching classes and everything. We had those who may have heard of it, and they still may be available, the Return to Ilm conferences. Dr. Bilal Phillips used to come, Dr. Jibali. Then we had leadership, unified leadership. Some problems started bubbling under the service after 9/11, the way forward, the tensions that were coming and everything like this, the slanders that some didn't want to be attached to, the slanders, even though they were slanders, are like, we don't want that to be on us and everything. And so things started fracturing at that particular point. So it can happen, I would say. It did happen. And we need to look at not that model, but we need to identify and get behind and respect those who have the leadership qualities to take things forward. And I think if you want to add something, we will conclude on that, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan. No, I think, I guess emphasizing the last point, and respect. Because people don't respect. They don't respect knowledge. They don't respect. I'm just finding that in every respect. And it's not endemic to just the communities and so forth we talked about, but in general, people are very demanding and they don't respect anything. You could study 4,000 years and you could do this and you could have this leadership and what have you. People generally, you know, I think it's just a new age and a new culture, whereas you did have a better type of respect in the past. I don't think you have that. So we
they don't want to give now.
Yeah.
Everyone, they're takers. Many are takers, and they expect you.
Well,
they expect you to be the. They expect you to be the service provider.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
They've got to put in. They've got to put in if we're going to move things forward.
Yeah,
Khalid,
it's only going to hurt our communities. Jazakallah khair. Allah yabarak feek, doctor. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I don't know what happened, but I had to just switch the whole camera and everything. So, but alhamdulillah, at least we're able to conclude and so forth. Well, alhamdulillah.
No, Jazakallah khair. I really appreciate you jumping back on. I really appreciate, Malahat, you're right, consumers, that's right, we can't just be consumers. I really appreciate the input from the participants, always engaging. And we look forward to seeing you in a fortnight, inshallah, and discussing things more embracing, more engaging, more challenging. Thank you for your for that, Octavia.
And that'll probably be the last for Ramadan, I think, or something like that.
It will be. It'll be the last one before Ramadan. And we hope everyone's getting the benefits of Sha'ban at the moment, inshallah. And we look forward to seeing you in a fortnight. Jazakumullah khair, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.